Okay.
Needs to be taken care of.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Megan. And welcome everybody. Great to see you. And welcome to those joining online as well. So we're thrilled today to welcome Dr. Elke Kellner to the research series, visiting scholar here at the workshop, presenting her piece, How to Find the Balance Governing Trade-off Situations in Mining of Transition Minerals for Energy Transition. Dr. Kellner is the Marie Curie Fellow, correct me if any of this is outdated, okay? At the School of Sustainability, College of Global Futures and Center for Behavioral Institutions and the Environment at Arizona State. And has a number of interdisciplinary research projects underway, including, of course, in the field of sustainable resource governance, and a cool citizen science project on wildlife monitoring. So we're thrilled to feature your work, Elke, and look forward to hearing your remarks. And then, per usual, everybody will follow those online and those in the room. I need to take off just a few minutes early for a thing over at Kelly, but we'll tag team as we need to.
You as well as that.
Cool. That's perfect. So the floor is yours, Elke, and welcome again.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, and also welcome from my side. And yeah, today it's really an honor that I can present my work today here at the Ostrom workshop. Thank you very much. And so yeah, today I want to talk about the governance of mineral extraction, and I'm particularly interested in minerals which are necessary for the energy transition. So okay, it happens again. Okay, as all of you know, we face climate change, and the last 8 years have been the warmest on record. That means we really have to mitigate climate change. That means we have to decrease global greenhouse gas emissions, and 2/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions are energy related. That means we have to transform away from fossil fuels to low carbon solutions. And low carbon technologies play a key role in that. That means low carbon technologies are something like solar panels, electric cars, wind energy, and so on. However, all of these technologies need a lot of minerals. So we can see here an example. You see here a conventional car, and how many minerals does that need? And then an electric car, and you see the electric car needs much more minerals. Here we have a wind example and a PV example. And because I focus today on a copper case study, a copper mine in Arizona, this is, for example, the blue one is the copper. So if you want to limit global warming to 2 degrees, which is the goal of the Paris Climate Agreement, we need 4 times more minerals in 2040. And that is already in 16 years. So if we want to reach net zero by 2050, we need 6 times more minerals also in 15 years. And perhaps you think about, okay, what is about recycling of minerals? The current recycling rate is, the recovery and recycling rate of minerals is very low. We don't have really good data on that, but we expect that in 2040, in 15 years, we can recycle around 10% of most of the minerals which we, for example, need for batteries for electric cars. That means we still, 90% of the minerals have to be generated through mining activities, through new mining activities, or of course, existing minings. And last year, a very interesting study came out from colleagues from Australia. They published in Nature Sustainability this map. And here you can see all the current and proposed mines for energy transition. And you can see the yellow dots are the dots where the mines are on indigenous land or on land which is important for indigenous communities. And that is really the global mining. These are all the global mining projects. And you see also here the US, North Europe, Australia, also in developed countries, there are a lot of new proposed mines. So again, 45% of all these mines are located on or near indigenous people's land. The good news is that 70% of these projects are in their initial planning phase. So there's still some room for improvement for policies and governance processes. So that is also my motivation for that project. But of course, we have to see that what is the perspective of the indigenous communities on all these projects. And the indigenous world leaders warned last spring at the UN summit in New York that these Western climate strategies are again kind of a green colonialism. So to wrap up a little bit, we face climate change. We have the Paris Climate Agreement. It was signed in 2015, and we need transition. We need to support energy transition. On the other hand, in the same year, most of the countries also signed the Sustainable Development Goals, which is also about justice issues, biodiversity, and other things. And so there, when we think about mining on indigenous lands, it comes to trade-off situation, very obviously, and also conflicts about that. So that is my underlying research interest, the governance of these trade-off situations for just energy transition. Okay, so this is the trade-off situation, and now we see what is about the governance. We can see a kind of a governance paradox, because we have to really promote mining projects, of course, in a way to meet the high international demand for the minerals. You have seen that we need 4 or 6 times more minerals in 15 years. On the other hand, we have to conduct long-lasting participative processes with the affected indigenous communities to find really just solutions. So therefore, my overall research question is, which governance approaches would trigger feedback mechanisms in the current system to enable transformative change towards just mineral extraction on indigenous land? Perhaps I can explain a little bit. So I'm interested in the governance approaches. How can we implement governance approaches for more just mineral extraction? But I'm also interested in the whole system dynamics. So what are the feedback processes if we implement one governance intervention? What does that mean for the whole system? So which kind of feedback processes, positive and also negative feedback back processes will follow? But this is really a bigger project, and I'm currently in the beginning of that. And so one of my first research aims is more on individual case study level. And I'm really interested to develop a system characterization, and I map the system dynamics of individual case studies. And therefore, I use a qualitative case study approach. I selected case studies only in developed countries. And I'm currently doing semi-structured interviews, document analysis, and so on. And then I do a qualitative content analysis where I use Max QDA as a software, so to code the interviews, the transcriptions. However, there are some limitations in that method because I'm not allowed to do interviews with indigenous communities. So I don't get the institutional, it's the IRB process at the universities, that means the Institutional Review Board. And yeah, because in the US, I'm very new. I live here now for more than 2 years, but you have to build more trust relationship with indigenous communities to be allowed to talk to them. So a very common strategy to overcome that is to do interviews with boundary organizations. So boundary organizations are usually NGOs which work with indigenous communities for long times. They build trust already, they advocate for them. So, and that is a really good way to do interviews with them. So coming to my first case study, it's the Resolution Copper Mine, Arizona. Perhaps some of you heard about that. It's 1 hour east of Phoenix, where I lived before. And it's a proposed underground copper mine. And it's on public land, so it's under the National Forest Service. And it's expected to support 3,700 jobs. And what is really interesting, I think, in that case, it is expected to provide up to 25% of the US annual copper demand. That is really a lot. And I think it looks like a really important project. But on the other hand, this land is considered as sacred by Native Americans. And it's also a recreational area. There are a lot of rock climbers, and also there's a campground. And so this is how it looks like. And of course, the mine would have some positive impacts. And when we think about SDGs, it would have it would impact the economics, so economic growth through tax revenue, job creation, which is SDG 8. Of course, it also would have positive impact on the global environment through supporting the energy transition, and that is SDG 7. On the other hand, we have negative impact on the social and cultural issues. So as I mentioned, it's an important land for indigenous communities. So it would threaten tribal values, cultural resources, and there are a lot of justice issues. So, and also it would be a loss of the recreational opportunities. Also, we have negative impact on the local environment. Positive on the global because of climate change. Locally, it would impact the environment negatively through pollution. The mine needs a lot of water resources and also biodiversity because it would really destroy the whole area. So it's a block caving method which destroys the whole area. So a loss of biological resources, and which is SDG 15, and then water-related SDG 6. And that's another. And next, I would like to present you my framework, which I use in that for that case, or in general in that project. But before I come to the framework, I think it's really necessary to get a little bit some insights. What is my general understanding of social ecological systems? Because that is the reason why I have chosen that framework and not another. So how do I see social ecological systems? So from my perspectives, these are nested sets of co-evolving social and ecological elements, which are connected through feedbacks, time lags, and also cross-scale interactions. And here you can already see a little bit the framework which I use. It's the social ecological action situation framework, which does not only have social action situation, but it also integrates ecological action situations and social ecological action situations. So everything is in that network. It's not contextual factors, it's integrated in the whole network. And so when I talk about these co-evolving social and ecological elements, I mean these action situations. And then there's a continuous interplay between the micro-level elements, and then also these elements create a social ecological phenomenon. That's a little bit the outcome in our language from the IID framework or something. So that is very similar. And this again feedbacks back to the individual elements here on the micro level, but also the interactions between the individual elements. That means that it creates feedback processes that shape the whole evolution of the system. And therefore, we also have a little bit of limited predictability, of course. So there is this continuous adaptive responses between elements and between the elements in this phenomenon. And what also means that social ecological systems are more than the sum of social or ecological elements. And they need to be understood from my perspective as complex, adaptive, co-evolving systems. So because these systems are shaping and are being shaped by one another and continuously co-evolve. And this is why we talk about this intertwinedness in social ecological systems. So what does that mean for governance? So there is as we can see, and also because of globalization and all these processes, there's an increased connectivity between humans, the ecological systems, and also the technological systems. So we have to understand complex chains of causation, complex adaptive systems behavior, path dependencies, tipping points, and so on. And also, of course, the governance systems also has a shift from more simple governance system many years ago to more complex governance system, what we have today. So I like that sentence. I want to explain it a little bit, but so it's really important that we understand the role of governance in complex systems and also governance as a complex system. So this is a little bit the two perspectives which I think are really important if you want to study the governance of social ecological systems or for social ecological systems. Okay, after give you some insights on my personal understanding of social ecological systems, I want to come to the framework. I already introduced it a little bit. So it was mainly developed by Maja Schlüter and her colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Center in Sweden. And as I mentioned, they integrate also ecological action situation. So I want to give you some definitions of these action situations. And that is, I think most of you are familiar with that definition of the social action situation. It's from Ostrom. So they are defined as venues for interaction between two or more actors. Okay, and then very intuitive. You can think about a social ecological action situation. In these action situations, we have a social part, so humans, and then which interact with non-human elements. So a fisher who fishes fish or harvests fish, let's say. So this is a social ecological action situation. It's very intuitive in a way. It's hard to use it, the framework, it's not so easy, but in the first, the action situations I think are very intuitive. So next, the ecological action situation, they are all the situations which are really about the ecological system. So what about the fish connected to other things underwater, like other plants, other animals, the whole ecosystem? This is part of the ecological action situation. So the interactions here in the whole ecological system. Okay, so this is a little bit, these are the definitions, and now I want to come back to the IID framework and a little bit to show what is perhaps the development of that, but only very quickly. So yeah, I think most of you are familiar with the IID framework. The core of the IID framework is the action situation, and when we think about, okay, where's here the ecological part? If you have now this lens from the social ecological action situation framework, so where are the ecological parts? And we see it here, of course, in the contextual factors. These are the biophysical conditions. And then where are the social parts? The social system is mainly, of course, in the action situations, but also here as the attributes of the communities in the contextual factors. The institutions, also very important, are here. And then we have all these feedback mechanisms, of course, also already integrated in that framework for sure. This is the next step. So the network of action situation approach is adapted a little bit from Mike McGuinness. So that's how I use it in some of my publications and with colleagues. So it's very similar to the IID framework, but we have not only one action situation, we have a network of action situation. So we see here now several action situations which are adjacent and they interact. And then we have usually one main focal action situation which is impacting the outcome, and we have also the contextual factors. So again, the ecological part is here, the contextual factors, social part are the network, and here the institutions are still here, and we have again the same feedback mechanisms, of course. Coming now to the social ecological action situations framework, that is the main, I think, the difference and the change or the shift is to integrate the ecological part into the whole network and also to frame it as an action situation. So the ecological part is in the ecological action situation and also in the social ecological. Social part is, of course, here, and then also in the social ecological part. Where are the institutions? Some of the issues we are still struggling with. So I work a lot with Maja Schlüter together and her colleagues on that issue. But for example, the institutions could be an outcome of one social action situation. So it could be here, for example, as an outcome, the institutions. And then, as I mentioned before, the integration of all these different kind of feedback mechanisms in the system. But it is not only that. Usually when we use it, it's also a network. It's very similar to the network of action situation approach, but we integrate also the other two action situations. So what does this mean? Also, with this framework, we want to overcome this dichotomy between human and nature a little bit, and really to understand the system development as a dynamic process of this co-evolving social ecological relationships, and really that we are also able to diagnose the intertwined nature of the social ecological system. Okay, so in the beginning, the aim of this framework was really to understand the causes of the emergent SES phenomenon. So really to build hypotheses and all these, to map that out and to get a better system understanding. But over the years, so they published it first 5 years ago, and now we applied it to different case studies. And so, for example, I use it also with stakeholders, decision makers together in a paper where we use that framework really to envision a future. So we were thinking about which kind of governance intervention we have to integrate into the system and what does that mean for the whole system dynamic, how that will change the system dynamic. So really to envision potential sustainable futures, and then also as a participatory tool. For example, Laura Herzog, one of my colleagues, used it with her colleagues, and also in a participatory process. Okay, that was a little bit about the framework, and now I want to present my results from this specific case study. As I mentioned, it's a broader project, but currently I'm here at that point. So what were the local governance approaches in that resolution copper mine project to balance the trade-off situation? That is my main interest. So we see the trade-off situations, we have the indigenous people, we want to have energy transition, but what is, how do they govern that? So they use two local governance approaches, and I will explain it a little bit deeper in a minute, but they use the National Environmental Policy Act processes, and also they did a land exchange bill. So coming to the first approach, I don't know, but perhaps some of you are familiar with this process, with the NEPA process, and it was led by the Forest Service. So they had to do an environmental impact assessment, of course, because the mine is impacting the environment and also it has some social implications. In the US, it's still called environmental impact assessment, but it has also some social aspects which are recognized in that process. So they did a lot of public comment periods and also public hearings, which is one of where this photo was made. And one of my students at ASU, she studied the procedural justice in the NEPA process. So she just had her defense last week on the eclipse day, but I could attend. So, and I don't want to focus on that here today, but if you're interested in that, she will come to the WOW 7 and she will have a presentation about her thesis on that issue. She really focused on the justice issue in this NEPA process. Okay, so what is the next, what was the land exchange bill? So in 2014, the Congress in the US approved a land exchange bill. What means the land, as I mentioned in the beginning, the land of the mine is currently a public land. It's from the managed by the Forest Service. So they want to change the property rights for that land, that the copper mine is the owner of the land. And what they have agreed here is after 60 days of publishing the environmental impact statement, automatically, despite the results of the environmental impact statement, they will do the land exchange. And they will exchange the land that the copper mine will get the land, will be the owner of this land, and therefore they give the Forest Service other different parcels of land which will be protected in the future. So that is the deal. And the interesting thing is that is independently of the environmental impact assessment statement and whatever. And 5 days under Trump administration, in the last 5 days, they published the environmental impact statement. But then when Biden, under Biden's administration, they stopped directly that process, and it's still, since then it stopped. So they did the environmental impact assessment, everything, the statement is there, but they don't publish it currently because after that, after 60 days, the land exchange would happen. And Biden said he wants to connect and consult more the indigenous perspectives, but nothing really happens and a lot of court processes. So if that would happen, what we can expect, I think, what we will see, no balance of a trade-off situation would happen. And I will go into that detail on my next slides. So using the framework now, what does it mean? How does that look like using the framework? I think you're also curious about that. So yeah, starting, I only as a reminder, so red is social ecological is dark blue, and then lighter blue is ecological action situation. So the main ecological action situation, of course, is that the copper is in the soil, so the minerals are in the soil. And then we have the company, the mining company, which extracts the copper from the soil. And that is because there's this external driver, let's say, for energy transition, which is SDG 7. Okay, however, this extraction process leads to land destruction. This is again an ecological action situation. The land is destructed, which leads to a threat to the heritage, because the Native Americans use the land for their ceremonies, for their spiritual activities, collecting plants for medicine, and so on. On the other hand, the land destruction also leads to biodiversity loss, because it's completely destructed, which is SDG 15. The extraction process also needs a lot of water, which is a threat to the local community. And now we can see here very clear the trade-off. We have on the one side SDG 7, which would be supported, of course, also other issues like the economic, and so I focus now mainly on that. And then on the other side, it's a threat to the heritage, biodiversity, and water. So, and now we don't have integrated a social action situation, or we wonder, okay, what was the answer from the government to that? What is the governance approach now to balance that trade-off situation? And what they have done is, as I mentioned before, they do the NEPA process, so the environmental impact assessment, and all these representatives participated here in that process, indigenous communities, NGOs, which represent the nature or the biodiversity loss, and also local communities participated in the process. And then also they implemented this land exchange bill, which leads to this new ecological action situation, because they changed the land and they will protect this new land. So what we can see is there is a kind of, when we think about what is the social ecological phenomenon now, so what can we see if that would happen? It is a kind of balance between these two. I mean, they destroy something here, but they protect other land. So we can say there's a kind of balance for the biodiversity issues, but for sure not for the other issues. So there's interests for indigenous and local communities, and then they expect local water scarcity, but of course it supports energy transition. Okay, and then as all of you know, this is only a small local governance process, but always these governance processes are nested in bigger governance processes and in international governance processes, of course. So we can also think about other, what could impact that situation. So for sure, there are also some external drivers why they decided to do that. I don't go into that detail today. And then we also can think about the companies, for example, Tesla or General Motors and so on, all of these electric vehicle companies which already start to make contracts with the mining companies that they get the minerals. If they get the permission for the mines, they arrange that they get how much they get, for how many minerals they get from that. So we have these companies which are, and then the whole supply chain, including the consumers who buy an electric vehicle or solar. So, and if you go a little bit deeper, only these are my last slides, to when we think about, because my question is, what are governance approaches to trigger this change and to trigger to perhaps to implement governance intervention and also to trigger feedback mechanisms in the whole system. So we still have to understand that this is part of a bigger chain, and we have the mining company which extracts the minerals in the beginning, and then the companies who use the minerals to produce these products, and then we have the consumers who buy that. So so we can think about different kind of where are starting points to interact in the system. I don't want to go into too much detail, but of course we have the permission process, what I showed in the beginning, the local governance approaches, but then also there are some investors which invest in these mining companies, perhaps NGOs who write reports about the mining companies, same here. We can think about certification schemes for these products, and then also perhaps the national governments give subsidies for consumers. For example, usually they subsidize if you buy an electric car or something, but then this should be coupled with specific requirements for where are the minerals coming from. So, and then information campaigns always have to help, of course, to raise awareness. But everything should be connected to really the main process at the beginning. That is my focus. So we see there are a lot of instruments around which could help. So like information-based instruments, market-based instruments, command and control, and so on. And of course, there are already some of them. It's not that we start nowhere. And for example, the environmental impact assessment, which we talked about from the NEPA process, that is one of where they try to fix that problem, of course. Then there are social license to operate for mining companies. And then some of the companies are part of the corporate social responsibility standards, or we have environmental and social life cycle assessments. But I did a literature review on that, and what I see is that all these standards and what exists currently mostly don't consider approaches to ensure indigenous rights and acknowledge really indigenous knowledge systems. So it's already, it shifted from only focusing on the environment, also integrating social issues also in the environmental and social life cycle assessment, for example, but it's still not very well integrated the indigenous perspective. And that is the main focus here in that project. We have indigenous rights, of course, for example, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and so on. But what I also see in the literature, there's a huge gap between written standards and their enforcement. So one idea, when I also talked to Mike McGuinness, we came up with that a little bit. So we try to brainstorm, and I'm really curious to hear a little bit what you think. That is part of my project, but to do workshops with stakeholders, change agents, and so on. But also I would like to start brainstorming what could be solutions in general. So, and we thought about, this certification schemes are really important if it's coupled with subsidies, but really to break the colonialism. What is really important is that this is led by indigenous rights organizations and not again from Western scientific knowledge organizations. And that is important. And on the other side, that is also a challenge, of course. So, but I think we have to go in that direction. So to sum up, we face climate change, we need to energy transition, but all these technologies need minerals. And what we see is more than 50% of these proposed mines are on indigenous land. So that is the whole story of the project. And coming to my conclusions, from my perspective, we have to see this as a complex social ecological systems, and we have to acknowledge there are a lot of trade-offs between the different goals. And sometimes the narrative is, oh yeah, the global north is extracting in the global south. Yes, I agree. But also, even in developed countries with strong institutions, the companies use the governance gaps. And again, it impacts the most vulnerable communities. And I think it's more than understandable to speak here about green colonialism again. So we have to break that and really to identify a mix of collective, multi-level, I think, governance approaches in this supply chain. And for that, we first need a better understanding on the local level. So what really happens there, including the feedback mechanisms, and then the whole polycentric system of the value chain. And then most important, really to integrate indigenous knowledge in governance approaches. So, and I will finish again with a sentence like, it's a governance in a complex system and then also governance as a complex system. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. And I'm really looking forward to your questions, feedback, brainstorming about what you think. Thank you.
Quite the tour de force. Okay, the floor is open for both online and in the room. And
Student first.
of course, as always, Bernie, but thanks for the room. Absolutely. Please, yeah, maybe Simon and Nick, if that's okay, it'd be great.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed the whole presentation. I see this as a very complex issue. And you use the term just mineral extraction process, right? And I think that the lack of the participation of the indigenous group is one of the ways to kind of reshape the system. So I'm curious about in terms of indigenous people, how do you really define indigenous people, and are there any sub-communities within that would complicate the whole conversation? And the second is I'm just curious about what do you mean by indigenous knowledge system? How would a process look like integrating that type of knowledge system that can be reflected in the process?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, first of all, starting in the US with the indigenous people, I mean, that is very well defined who's indigenous or not, so, or they claim themselves like that. But of course, there are different kind of communities, indigenous communities, and sometimes I have also cases where they have different opinions and they are really in conflict, and that makes it very difficult also because, for example, in the one case study, they don't want to sit in one room together. So how can we find, that is really also difficult for the US government to find solutions if they are not willing to come in to sit in one room together. So that is a challenge, of course. And then also some of them support, of course, also the indigenous, the mining projects, and some of them fight against it. So with different, because of different reasons. So that is really important that you ask, because I think we don't want to share, what is it in English, but to say there's only one group and that is homogeneous or whatever. That is really could be a trap. I didn't go into that detail here, but I see that in the case studies that there's a lot of differences, and therefore that is also why I said, like, okay, if we want, for example, that the indigenous rights organization would lead a certification process. So what that means, who is representing them? So do they have, because yeah, that's yeah, I only can say I acknowledge, I see that, I observe that, but I have to figure out better what to do with that. Yeah. So, and then regarding the indigenous knowledge system, yeah, that is interesting because sometimes also in the NEPA process, they have categories which are really from the Western scientific knowledge system, and the commands which they submit doesn't fit in that. And we also looked at that, whether they submit something where they explain something, their relationship to nature and why this hurts them if there would be a mine. But this is really it doesn't fit in any of the categories of the NEPA process. And then they leave it out. So this is an example for that, yeah. Or also they, what was the other example in the long run? Like, I forgot, sorry. It's really also when they talk about compensatory measures, sometimes it's not a compensation for them and they have worldview. So this is really because all these standards and all the processes and categories are from Western, based on the Western scientific knowledge. It's just, yeah. Love to change.
Just to flag something, there was a case in the Ninth Circuit that you might have heard about in March on these issues with NEPA, but then also, and I think this is helpful because you pointed to indigenous rights under international treaties. There's lots of interesting, very confusing right now stuff going on in the Ninth Circuit about RLUIPA and RFRA as a means of protecting indigenous religious liberties. So this is super interesting because, you know, when you've got these land federal lands that then are being transferred for mining. Indigenous groups can bring RLUIPA claims that may or may not be successful, but I think there's actually, there's a lot that might happen there because it's very strange bedfellows, because jurisprudence is really shifting towards religious liberty. But this would also include indigenous religious liberty if they've got lands that are sacred. So yeah, that it was a copper mining case that just came out, Apache something.
That's this case.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really this case. And this is sometimes also interesting to see which kind of coalitions the indigenous communities build to fight against something. And that is, in that case, they build coalitions with the religious groups, usually not the partners, but they fight for this religious freedoms activities. Yes. Yeah, that would be another really interesting thing. All these coalitions. In another case, they build a coalition with mining with the gas and oil companies and Republicans to fight for the gold. So like it shifts all the time, and that is only to map coalitions in these cases would be very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Good flag. I think Mike, yeah.
Could I just follow up on that? Because we talked yesterday.
Yeah.
You were talking about one of the options, that there are basically two different options for how this company would extract the resource.
Yeah.
One of which, at least some of the indigenous people there have said would be consistent with their understanding of still treating the mountain as a religious sort of a sacred sort of object, and another that would not. And the former would naturally cost more. And so the company's not likely to do that unless it's sort of forced to do that. So is the current status, I'm going to lie directly into it. So is the current status that it's the company doesn't yet have access to the resources? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so the part of this court process would be to decide whether that's going to be allowed or not. And so you're basically saying there is a way for at least some of the Native people's concerns, or religious concerns and cultural concerns, to be incorporated in this process in a way that makes it consistent with the still the environmental aspect of it, and that sort of balances all this sort of out. So there is still a way out of this.
Yeah.
In this case.
Yes.
So what's going to happen?
Yeah, thank you. That is really interesting. So here they use the block caving method. I'm not an expert in this method, but I try to learn a little bit. And that means really they start underground, and then the soil is cracking down more and more, and then you have a really big hole in it, in the whole area. So it really destroys everything. Another method would be that the landscape would be still intact, but they work underground. And that is also what the indigenous communities propose, and that would be okay for them in a way, to use that method, but it's less economically efficient. And the issue for the companies, and I think that would be, from my understanding, a kind of balance of this situation, because then the landscape would be intact. If the indigenous communities accept that solution, that's fine. And I mean, and that is also where this green colonialism comes in, I think, this thinking, because the mining, if you really want to find sustainable solutions and just energy transition issues like that, they have to invest that. I mean, it's not they don't earn money off that mine, but a little bit less, let's say, with the other method. And I think that would be a sustainable and also just solution. But it's not under discussion. They don't discuss it. Even a lot of comments are about that. It came up in the interviews again. But no one is discussing that as an option also. Yeah, so that is, I think, really, that's.
So no one is really proposing that.
Yeah, no, it's not an option. And I think that would be the solution in a way, in that case. I mean, but it would be, and here we see what is the main goal of the mining company. Earn money and not to, save the world and support energy transition. So that's my personal opinion.
And I need to step out for a few minutes, but I no doubt my colleagues will be able to take over. But Gustavo, I think you're next, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, extremely important topic. I think that this is definitely a key trade-off. A couple of ideas that I was thinking. So one more at the micro level. Seems that part of the issue here is this very kind of strange type of property rights over this land. Okay, so essentially somebody has the ability to. So essentially there are different actors that they have rights to block, to say something. Okay, so if you are talking about a very clearly specified property right over a piece of land or an asset, most of these things will happen. No, so essentially you either authorize or you don't authorize for a given price or any offer. So maybe the historical part is kind of important here. So a lot of land or resources that have been allocated in this kind of communal form that now is becoming like essentially a huge transaction cost for this, okay? Because it's like there are so many actors that needs to be that needs to agree for this resource to be used, that essentially the status quo of the pro non-use bias is huge, no? So that's at the micro level. Then at the macro level, I'm thinking that here some political economy problem that from my perspective would be interesting is essentially we're kind of in an equilibrium in which we want something, but we don't want the cost of associated with that. And then that's essentially non-feasible. That's not feasible. So essentially you want more minerals. You need to relax regulations for mining and absorb many costs associated with that. You don't want those costs, well, you have less minerals. So it's a very simple trade-off. But essentially what we are doing is we are kind of increasing the demand of minerals and then adding more restrictions for the supply of those minerals. And that is the political equilibrium, which in my perspective is the worst possible equilibrium. No? So one good equilibrium is that we just don't go for the energy transition. So you don't have energy transition, and then you have all the other good benefits that you don't need to mine a lot. The other option is to absorb all those costs and you have your energy transition. But like subsidizing the energy transition and then restricting the supply of a key input for the energy transition, that's kind of the worst possible combo, no? But I think we are, so in more and more political issues, we are reaching that kind of equilibrium. We demand, then we restrict supply, and then we end up with that, okay? And the question I think is why? Which I don't have an answer, but I think it's an interesting one.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So, Gustav, I have a question here on this, right? Because when you say the worst possible equilibrium,
Yes.
the whole point of Elke's presentation is about trade-offs and mitigating those trade-offs, right? And one question I have for you is, when you say worst possible equilibrium, my expectation, and you can firmly disagree with this, is that we're talking from an efficiency perspective. And so the question is, might there be other evaluations we might care about beyond the sort of, and I don't mean to suggest that the costs that you're talking about are only monetary or fiscal. What I am suggesting is that if at the end of the day, that equilibrium is totally unfeasible from an efficiency perspective, and frankly, from an incentive compatibility perspective, when it comes to the mines, there still might be reason to consider it if we think about the extent to which, well, are there other ways in which we can think about those costs being perceived or absorbed either more diffusely, right? Or from essentially a different evaluative perspective. And again, like you could say no. I'm just curious. I'm curious if, in terms of like the worst possible equilibrium being primarily from the perspective of how do you balance this very clear, like high cost, low cost.
I mean, you want more mines, you want more minerals, you need a lot of mining projects. They take, I don't know, for some minerals take like around 15 years to mature. So they need to have incentives to invest in those things. And if they're going to be going over a process to reach a deal that takes forever, that's at cost. So essentially that costs and that delays the projects. So what I mean it's you want the energy transition, you deregulate a lot of stuff and you absorb those costs. And then if you want, go and use the budget to compensate losers. But like adding more regulation there when you want to reduce the cost of this, from my perspective, looks like completely incompatible.
Can I follow up on Jess's perspective here?
Yeah.
Because it's not a question, it's a political question because it's who's going to pay those costs. And so it's not just an efficiency question of where the costs are going to be paid, but it's who's going to pay them. And if you follow the logic you're saying, the Native Americans in that community should say, okay, well, we like that mountain for thousands of years, but okay, everybody else says we need to get more energy efficiency. So we'll make a sacrifice for the world as a whole. Why should they have to pay those costs?
But you can
Why should they have to pay those costs?
you can perfectly compensate, or you can give the right, so they sell to a price that compensate for that use. Assign the right properly, so you can also sell the mining rights, and then you internalize.
But sort of
One time is more valuable.
what happens though if that increases the cost of the mining so high that it's no longer efficient, it's no longer incentively compatible for the firms, and we don't get those minerals? That's the problem.
That's
is that-
efficient. That's an
the
efficient
problem.
allocation.
How do you make those kinds of
That's
changes?
an efficient allocation.
And who's making those kinds of decisions? And the reasons regulations are being put on is to protect the rights of the actors who otherwise would have no say in it. The Native Americans.
Sorry,
Why the regulations are there?
we're discuss, okay.
You've got us arguing, so what's your perspective on it?
No. That's in my, I can do that each day in my own brain. I want to hear you. That's why I'm here. No, I love the discussion. No, I think only, I have to think about that, but I think that this is the specific case here where there is a solution, kind of solution or balance which costs more. But in other cases, there is no this kind of solution. And what do we do then? Because I think compensating with money is not an option if it's sacred land or something. You can't compensate. That's really the problem, I think. You can't compensate with, okay, you can take that area of land or that piece of land, or you get money, or you get whatever. I mean, if this is really on sacred land, to be honest, I don't know, perhaps, do we know whether there are minerals, we talked about that yesterday, under the White House? We don't know, perhaps no one is looking for that. Perhaps we only look for minerals on these kind of lands. I don't know. I really have no idea how they look for new mining projects in the US, whether this is also kind of, okay, let's only check out these areas.
Because you take into account the costs, and it would be less costly in many ways to dig under some Native American land than it would be to dig up the White House.
Yeah.
Oh, God, yeah.
And that's why you're going there to.
Shot.
No. Question here, right? What is the cost of stopping that in each case? Right, so in the White House case, you could either A, pass some regulation that says X, Y, and Z, be relatively easy to pass that, I would imagine, right? For a relatively defined set of area and a few set of actors, right? In the Native American context, as you very well laid out, right? A, you have probably a larger diversity of actors that you would have to satisfy, and therefore a larger opportunity for people to interrupt that process. And so one could argue actually that the comparison sounded outlandish, but actually it's kind of helpful for thinking about like, not only the question of veto players, right? But also essentially how easy is it to impose costs on actually pursuing those directions, right? And I think that's actually kind of a helpful. I'm not sure I would use the White House and did this example in a paper, but like.
Yeah, no, that's
Can I have a follow-up? So is that, that's the right to authorize the mining company to mine? That's the key question.
I think it's the Department of Interior in the US, right?
Because they own the land initially.
On the land, okay, and then that's it. If they say yes,
So in the
says yes.
Yeah, so they do the NEPA process usually, and then they have the statement, and that in that is the information for the decision maker, yeah.
So another way of saying is like, well, what I'm saying is that this is not a legitimate right.
Sorry.
Well,
He's doing
if
it.
that's the case, we need to change the rights. You need to give rights to these people that use this land for other uses, give formal rights, have rights, and then they need to authorize the mining process.
I think that's what the legal cases do the Native American tribe here have on religious grounds, the basis to say, you can't do that because we have a right to that land in that mountain. And so you, Forest Service, cannot sell this to a corporation because we have the religious rights. So, I mean, it's a dispute on whose
But
rights.
If you're allocated, so if the courts allocate the rights to indigenous people, then indigenous people right implies that you can sell that right too. So they have the right to say to the mining company, you know, we want in the courts the right to this piece of land, and now it's more valuable for us to sell it to the mining
It
company.
should still be their right to not sell it, no matter what price you offer.
Yeah.
Of course.
If it's sacred, then that would be sort of the way.
They're not reservation lands, right? They're just
No,
specified as safe.
Yeah, that is also the
Right.
a little bit the challenge. It's not because then they would have the rights. It's not reservation land, but it was of course former their land. So that is also why I question a little bit this map. I don't know whether you have seen that. Is not every dot in the US was yellow, but I think it should be. Wait.
That map, what does it say about Alaska?
Okay, I will,
Because the property rights in that context are totally different.
yeah. I should go on it.
But I think we have
Right.
somebody online, no, I don't know.
Yeah, is there some?
They just were plotting the
Okay,
the
now,
debate.
yeah.
We got it, we saw it.
We got it.
Charlie has he has his hands up.
Oh, yeah, then,
Yeah, go ahead and.
okay.
Charlie.
Oh, you've turned to me?
Yeah,
Hi. Oh, okay, and I don't know, I think there was some chat discussion too. I don't know if someone there wants to ask a question first.
I think Brenda was making a really nice point about the sort of inherent
Okay.
trade-offs associated with policy.
Okay. No, well, thanks. Elke, this was I really liked your articulation of your social ecological action situation framework. It was really great. That whole set of slides I really enjoyed. And I can really see your your overall research question really seems to be a really exciting long-term program. It's a big question, and I'm just excited about what you're trying to do. I guess, you then said your first research aim. So I guess my question is methodological, kind of moving forward. You said your first aim was to develop a system characterization by mapping system dynamics. And that's what you were doing in this presentation. Do you have more to do along this point? This is my first question. I have two other points to make. Where are you in the process? Do you feel like you've completed it, or do you have more to do?
Yeah, I think for this case, I have to do a little bit more research on that or more interviews also, but it's a question of the system boundary. I think whether I only focus on the local governance approaches, and this is my boundary currently. So I try to map out the system dynamics only on the local level, but not connected to the more polycentric international supply chain level. So that would be, I'm still not sure whether I first go on with other case studies and then I combine them and then because I think that is more, perhaps I plan to have 2 case studies in the US. So that would be perhaps makes more sense first to have on local level, case study level, individual, and then going to the more broader system as a whole, and then to map that out. And the idea is also of this to do participatory system dynamic modeling in a way that I would like to integrate stakeholders hopefully also right holders, the indigenous communities, if I'm allowed, and that they can also see that and correct me, and also that we find together what could be a governance intervention, and then how this would shape and change the whole system, what new dynamics would come in and so on. That's what I have done before in cases, and that's a little bit the idea. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, in fact, I know we're out of time or at time, just a couple reactions. One, I was wondering about cases where indigenous governance has been seen as being successfully implemented in the process of mineral extraction. If you've seen that before, I found myself thinking a bit about the Udall Center in Arizona that does conflict resolution stuff. And my main thought, for what it's worth, is, and you probably know about this, but I found myself thinking about the workshops, IFRI program that I talked about in my talk, about trying to develop a standard protocol for looking at these cases. And it feels to me like that's maybe what you're trying to do over the long term. And then I also found myself thinking about Lynn Ostrom's NIIS project, the Nepal Irrigation Institutions and Systems Project, where she coded already documented cases. And I thought, if you may know about that, but if you haven't, there's a lot of literature in the workshop on that, and that might be a direction for you to head in the future. Anyway, I'll close with that. It's really exciting work, and I look forward to talking to you more in the hallways. Thanks.
Thank you very much. What? Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the positive feedback. Only to say, yeah, I'm also planning that as part of the project to develop a standard protocol for all these cases. I think that's really important to accumulate knowledge. We really have to, and also that means for this framework, how to use it and how to integrate a little bit better the indigenous knowledge in cultural issues in that framework. I'm still struggling with that, how to integrate that. And yeah, thank you for all the other comments.
All right, well, we should continue. I think there are cookies to facilitate people staying around and continuing the conversation, but for the moment, a round of applause.